All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Dina Beard. I'm the director of the lab. The lab sits on the ancestral land of the Ramaytush Ohlone people. So we'd like to thank them and acknowledge them for their work stewarding this land, and hopefully we can return it to them at some point when we come to our senses. The lab is a nonprofit organization that's been around for 36 years. Our only goal is to really provide a material support to the artists that we serve. That means that we commission artists up to $100,000 each. We provide them keys to our space and the option to revise any and all aspects of our operating model. So our current commissioned artists are playwright Asher Hartman, poet Tongo Eisen Martin, and the dancers Jose Abad and Keith Hennessy. So the pandemic, of course, has hit us hard, like it has so many other arts organizations and institutions. We've lost more than $250,000 this year in ticket sales and rental income. We are absolutely committed to continuing to pay artists at the same amount that we were paying them before the pandemic. Otherwise, like, why would we exist? But we need your help to do that. And so if you would be able to make a donation or become a member on our website at thelab.org, 100% of the proceeds that we get from donations and memberships goes to artists. So consider doing that and you'll be helping us enormously to get through this moment in time. Memberships start at $5 a month, so it's very, very affordable. So we started the forum as a way to respond directly to this moment and to share ideas across many geographical contexts. Zoe is currently calling in from Missouri and Nicholas is calling in from New York City. We've had people as far as Tiffany Shaw called in from Hong Kong and Wu Sang from Switzerland. So we've had a lot of breadth of people in conversation across many different, across the globe, basically having a conversation about how they're coping with this current moment. So this is really kind of comes in line with what we do at the lab, which is really have an interdisciplinary conversation. We really try to bridge activists and artists to really talk about ways of working and ways of doing things and how our imagination can thrive, especially when it's under duress like this. So this means that we really need you, the audience, to help contribute to the conversation as much as possible. So we really encourage you to try to ask questions, give proposals, help us kind of generate ideas. This really isn't a time to listen. This is a time, well, this is a time to listen, absolutely, but it's also a time to try to create that space for envisioning and imagining what might come after this moment. So please help us do that. If you're calling in from Zoom, you can use the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screen, or the raised hand function. We are trying to encourage people to use the raised hand function so we can hear your voice. So what you'll do is do the raised hand function, and then we'll go in order and enable your audio so you can ask a question live. If you're viewing on YouTube, just type in a comment in the comments bar, and we will try to get to that as well. So I'm so thrilled to have Zoe and Nicholas with us here today to talk about the responsibilities of the museum in this moment. Nicholas Mirzoeff is a visual activist working at the intersection of politics, race, global, and visual culture. He has been active in the movement to take down statues commemorating settler colonialism and/or white supremacy, and convened the collaborative syllabus, All the Monuments Must Fall, which you can find on the event page of our website. So please download that and look at that brilliant syllabus as soon as you can. He curated Decolonizing Appearance, an exhibit at the Center for Art Migration Politics in 2018 to 2019. He is a frequent blogger and writer, especially for the art magazine Hyperallergic, and his work has appeared in The Nation, New York Times, Frieze, The Guardian, Time Magazine, and The New Republic. Zoe Samuzi is a doctoral candidate in medical sociology at the University of California, San Francisco. Her research engages colonial biomedicine, visuality, German colonialism in the 1904 to 1908 Herero and Nama genocide in present-day Namibia. Her writing has appeared in The New Inquiry, The New Republic, Art in America, Hyperallergic, and Arts.Black. She is a contributing writer at Jewish Currents. Along with William C. Anderson, she is a co-author of one of my favorite books, which is As Black as Resistance, Finding the Conditions for Our Liberation from AK Press. So thank you so much for joining us, Zoe and Nicholas, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
It's really great to be back at the lab. I wish I could be there in person. And thank you so much for joining me in a conversation today, Nick. As we're both enthusiasts of Roads Must Fall, I wanted to start with a recent article. I'm not gonna read the whole thing, but a part of a recent article by Tulile Gamedze called Destruction Styles, Black Aesthetics or Rupture and Capture. So I'm just gonna read the beginning of it. So we start off, I think that I and many others involved with the Roads Must Fall movement at the University of Cape Town and beyond might have preferred on the 9th of April, 2015 to see A, Cecil's head explode, blast site of bronze shards glistening in the afternoon sun on the sprawling, clambering, continually inaccessible grounds of the university's main campus, or to watch him B, corrode, to see him melt into chemical soup, nauseating smugness fall into dusty, pungent, metallic liquid, or to gather as he was, C, beheaded, the ugly likeness becoming a circulating prize, moving ritualistically for display between comrades' res or digs rooms. But the motherfucker just got airlifted. Until this moment, the texture of Roads Must Fall had been altogether different, the movement's decolonization denoting improvised instances of chaotic disruption directed by radically critical readings of the South African status quo. But the awkward, unfamiliar ceremonial tone of the removal seemed to have the unwarranted effect of instigating a feeling of unified resolve to the insurgent action that had preceded it. Cecil John Rhodes' gentle elevation in the fresh autumn air was a sinister aesthetic reminder that the power of coloniality, evident in this case in the South African neoliberal university's response to decolonial critique, is an immeasurable capacity to co-opt and reconstruct that which undermines it. Compare this institutionally paid for airlift for a moment to Edward Colston's recent drowning in Bristol. The labor of heavy lifting protesters never more at home, never less alienated in their bodies as they pulled him down and released nightmare to the depths. A world away from the weightlessness of air, from secured and safe removal, Colston fell heavy, drowned low and downward into deep water. This comparison serves to not detract from the necessity of Rhodes' removal, but rather to emphasize the fact that the insurgent act need not be defined purely by its outcome, that the statue is gone, but should also be read with regard to the extent to which it attends aesthetically to the historical or political problem at hand. Colston has been drowned. The physical destruction of or intervention in coloniality's life, always enacted with significantly varying modes of style, tone, embodiment, and performance, all formal and political choices that together can be regarded as an overall aesthetic. When read in terms of their aesthetics, modes of destruction of colonial images and objects, and symbolic choices relating to the manner in which resistance is expressed by decolonization movements may take on a variety of political meanings less evident in readings of protest that centralize tangible outcomes. The act of destruction or insurgency should be seen as an act, visibilizing through its aesthetic choices the connection between contemporary experiences of oppression and inherited historical traumas of the colonial project in slavery, land theft, genocide, and so on. Our collaborative efforts then, in annihilations of white supremacy, are inevitably as aesthetic practitioners, illustrating expressions of resistance, better guerrilla facing than seated at the table, that further enunciate or diminish the meaning around which our protests are based. Okay, I wanted to start with that because I read that recently and I thought that it felt really important. It felt really important thinking about the ways that institutions are able to praise themselves for doing things that they should have done 40 years ago. Right. And contrasting kind of the celebration of the belated removals with the kind of guerrilla takedowns that we saw with Columbus statues across the country and other Confederate monuments. So, you know, we've kind of talked about Rhodes and the internationalization of the Rhodes Must Fall movement, but I wanted to also talk about the Museum of Natural History.
Oh, yes.
Because you wrote that really terrific essay in Hyperallergic about, which I had not thought about, where you were like literally looking at the faces and the forms and kind of mapping them onto these eugenicist structurings of you know, empirical racial perfection.
So there's a lot in that, in what you've just said there. But first, I want to say it's so lovely to be here with you and to be sharing some thoughts. And I'm very grateful for that opportunity and for the lab for hosting us. I'm here in what was Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral lands of the Lenape, who have long since been removed from here. But the presence of the Indigenous is never far away, even in Manhattan. Broadway is the old Lenape Trail. There's the only street that runs across the grid, the modernist grid that's been imposed on the settler colonial city. But the oldest form of the river and that runs under Washington Square, and the road that runs up diagonally across the city. I went this week to see this bizarre new statue that's just been installed called the Medusa, who's cut off the head of Perseus. They've installed it in front of the county court. And it's actually in a place called Collect Pond, which was the largest freshwater site in Manhattan. And British settlers and others polluted it so that it was, by about the early 18th century, it was undrinkable, and it's been buried rather unsuccessfully. So the prisons that are now around this site are very damp, and water rises up in them to kind of constant indigenous resistance. And when he read that piece from South Africa, it was so resonant because of the way that the writer is understanding the monument as a historical process, as a process of erasure, as a process of coloniality, and something that is, I don't subscribe to this view that the monument is something that's invisible. I think it's extremely visible. It may be invisible to those to whom it reinforces their sense of presence. But I remember very strongly, right after the discussion at Charlottesville, an African-American woman who didn't give her name, but she was quoted in the media saying, "That thing always had its eye on me. I always knew it was there." And that's what, I mean, that sense that she describes of wanting to see the monument explode, destroy itself, it resonates really very much to me with Fanon and with what Fanon talks about in Wretched of the Earth, where he talks about the aesthetics of respect for the established order. And that's what he later calls the world of statues. And that's the world we're dealing with here. The established order monumentalizes itself, literally, in the lands of others and in the spaces and the heads of others. It gets in your head. And the American Museum of Natural History, oh my goodness. I mean, this is an astonishing thing. I mean, we could talk all afternoon about this. Here we are, the second largest museum in terms of attendance in New York, because everyone takes their children there. Probably the most New Yorkers go to this museum. I mean, the Met is a tourist destination, but have kids, or you're a guardian of children, or you need something to do with children, they're the dinosaurs, they're animals, there's a planetarium, you take them because they want to go. And then you walk past this monstrosity, you know, this monstrosity. And it's still there, unfortunately. But we should also remember that the first people to protest it in public were a group of young Indigenous folks who went there in 1971 and covered it from head to foot in red paint. I'm not quite sure how they got away with this or how they did this, but in the middle of the night, they absolutely saturated that thing. And then they wrote on the bottom, "Remember Alcatraz." And this was just after Alcatraz had been occupied by the American Indian movement. And so the first result of the action that those young people took was the establishment of the American Indian Community House here in Manhattan, which has just again for the second or third time been evicted out of its premises on the Lower East Side. So long historical moments are being revealed by these removals. And I think what your writer gets at, absolutely rightly, is that what coloniality wants is for this to sort of all disappear in a brief moment. There's this quick instant of removal, and then who knows where the Rhodes Statue is now? People have asked this, where is it? We don't know, right? It's sort of hidden somewhere. Unfortunately, the Roosevelt Monument is still very much on the Upper West Side. They went outside to measure it. We all got very excited, but nothing happened. It's still there. I don't want to talk for too long. We can come back to this question of the statue and its eugenic measurements and all of that. But I don't want to get into lecture mode here.
Yeah, I think I'm just thinking a lot about, and I think that maybe this is third on my outline, but I think that maybe this is a question that guides the rest of the conversation. And the question is, what is the relationship between the museum and the public? Is the purpose of the museum to be this kind of static, preserving in time historical documentation, or is it this living document, this living space? Because I almost think that if it is to be the latter, then it defeats its entire purpose.
Right.
Because if it is to be a living document, it does what John Berger talks about as this. Well, it does the opposite of what he talks about as this mystification, this distancing of history, of the canon, of art, of whatever from the public. But if it continually updates and it continually changes, then it exists as the antithesis of a museum, which is to be this trophy case, this memory of greatness, of conquest, of domination. And I don't want to ask, do we need museums?
I think you do, though. I think you do. I think that's exactly what you want to ask. I think this is where it needs to be a conversation. You have somebody like me, I work with museums sometimes, but I'm not committed to them in the sense that I'm interested in why museums exist. I'm interested in their social function. But when you outline the history that you just did, and we know that museums are a colonial institution. They were begun by, Napoleon taking stuff from Italy and moving it to the Louvre and then going to Egypt and removing things. And still to this day, right? I mean, in the course of the last week, one of the trustees of the British Museum was in British media saying, well, what kids want to do is see dead bodies. That's why they want to go to museums and see the mummies. And you think, really? Is this what this is actually? I mean, are we actually saying that as the headline statement of what the British Museum is for?
Right.
That's what you want to go onto British television and say. And, I mean, I was taken to the Tutankhamun exhibition as a small child. I mean, when you see those pictures, somewhere I'm in that queue, the beginning of the Blockbuster Museum. And it was the burial mask that was the thing to see then. But I realized that looking back on it now, that I was being acculturated as, I don't know what I was like, 10 or 11 or something like that, to the idea that seeing non-Western human remains is a form of cultural activity as opposed to a violation or just a frankly strange thing to do. I mean, we know that our elites like to do very strange things now. We've learned this from Jeffrey Toobin and Rudolph Giuliani and all these people, but this is a deeply strange thing to do, is it not? I mean, to go specifically to a place in order to see somebody's dead body. So it's hard to divorce that then and say, well, that's sort of contingent, or it's not really what this is about. If you take something like the American Museum of Natural History, which you mentioned, you know better than I, and you should talk to this in more detail, the way in which they have this extensive collection of human remains. But the scandalous thing to me was when they spoke to the New Yorker about it, they just casually said, oh, well, this is our most used collection here. And I thought, wow, this is the Museum of Natural History, which I suppose you think it's about butterflies or plants or whales or whatever it may be. But no, most people are going to that museum to work with human remains. And frankly, what is it that is so essential that has to be done? You know, I mean,
And that's the thing. Yeah.
what do you think? I mean, because I know you've done a lot of work in this area with these remaining. I think it really highlights the whole kind of peculiarity of the colonial museum, is that it tries to normalize this idea that a public form of entertainment is looking at dead bodies, human remains.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I didn't read the headline of this British person saying, well, it's because our children went to see them.
Grayson Perry.
As though children have a full, robust understanding of the world apart from like what they are socialized into understanding and learning.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't been to a natural hit. Well, I recently visited the American Museum of Natural History actually for the first time earlier this year, and saw the Roosevelt statue for the first time in person this year. And I was really struck by how huge it is.
Enormous.
But I was also incredibly struck by, you know, when you enter the museum on the kind of bottom basement level, there's this kind of diorama of like Indigenous people doing Indigenous people things, but this very particular portrayal of indigeneity that's always relegated to this primitivity and far pastness. And I always find it interesting that that is always the kind of state of Indigenous existence in this museum, or in these museums rather, especially when, for example, with all of the really devastating fires that are happening in California and across the West Coast, you finally have officials saying, well, actually, you know, these Indigenous practices of stewardship are what would have prevented the conditions for all of these incredibly devastating fires. So there's this really interesting chasm between where indigeneity exists in the kind of colonial imagination, and the functionality, and the presentness and the neededness of ways of relating to Earth, you know, existing on Earth and whatever. And it's so strange to me when I first learned about these kind of archival collections. And I think it was when I was a teenager and I was going on a tour of, I think, the Natural History Museum, the Smithsonian, because I lived in the DC area for a year when I was in 8th grade. And so my mom would let me go into DC by myself and go to all the museums. And I remember one time there was a curator talking about the archives and talking about the anthropological collections in the back of bones and everything. And I was like, oh, like more dinosaurs? And she's like, no, it's like people. And I was like, why are there people? And it wasn't a particularly like critical conversation. It was just a kind of pure confusion. And now that I'm studying this genocide that I think is incredibly formative for how we understand genocide. It's incredibly formative for how the German state structured itself as this kind of genocide producing state. You know, it's interesting that it's just like it's our most visited collection. When you think about the history of the collection, you know, the von Luschen collection was the teaching collection of Felix von Luschen, who was one of the founders of the Berlin Society for Anthropology, Ethnology, and Prehistory, which was like one of the biggest, I don't think they would call themselves eugenicists, anatomists, ethnologists, anthropologists in Europe. And the way that the collection expanded, the way that a number of these collections expanded, is because I think at some point in the 19th century it became illegal to cut apart European people and to dig up bodies in order to do autopsies on them to see what they look like inside. And so this curiosity was exported to the colonies. And so the collection is as huge as it is. I think when the collection was sold in 1914, there were like 5,000 pieces or something in it, from around the world. And a lot of the pieces in German collections were taken from concentration camps where, von Luschen, Wilhelm Waldeyer, who was the director of the Berlin Anatomical Institute, and a number of others had friends who were military officers in the Navy, in the Army, who were doctors, who were explorers, whatever, who would dig up graves, who would get the people who were interned in the concentration camps to clean skulls to send back to Germany. It's just this incredibly horrific means of acquisition. And it's been so interesting to watch the resistance to repatriation, especially with this lawsuit. And with the lawsuit being dismissed, the tension was basically that the courts acknowledged that the genocide happened, but there was not enough evidence of a connection between the genocide and the acquisition of remains to send them back or to undermine German immunity as a sovereign state. And so it's I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what to do with.
It's so interesting that your intuition as a child is right. What are the people doing here? That's the obvious question to ask.
They're not the natural world.
Right. And yet, somehow it gets into law, and my daughter's a lawyer, so I hear about this from her. The law is not obvious. She's always saying that, and they conclude that yes, there was a genocide, but the material interest in the genocide in the United States, according to this Foreign Immunity Act, was not proved, and so we don't do anything. And I mean, the same thing is true with the statue outside. That I've had this experience, and but to refer to a more famous person, Titus Kaffar talks about in his TED talk when he takes his children to the American Museum of Natural History, and he actually ignored the statue, and his children said, "Daddy, what's up with this statue?" And it wasn't actually, interestingly, that they recognized the history of racialization in it, but they said it was unfair because the one guy has the horse and the other two don't. And then obviously a Plains Indian would have had a horse. I mean, they just would. But the structural unfairness, they recognize that immediately. And that's what racial hierarchy is in the end, is the acquiescence to structural unfairness, isn't it? That certain bodies, certain people unfairly, but somehow organically receive more and are considered fully human in a way that others aren't. So that in the history of European art, the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp or something like that, at that point, it's normal to cut up European bodies. And then at a certain point, the European body becomes sacrosanct, that you can't do that to it. Oh, well, luckily there are these other bodies you can take because you've taken that land and so on. And that process then itself becomes naturalized to the extent that one endlessly has to just challenge the basic idea that human cultures don't belong in museums of natural history. Very simple point, I would have thought, on the basis of taxonomy. So and one of the reasons I kind of concentrate on this area is I think that people always want to talk about the grand universal museums when we raise these questions about should there be museums. They want to talk about the Met or the British Museum and how terrible it would be if a couple of million of their tens of millions of objects were returned to the people that made them. But they don't want to talk about these more difficult cases and many cases where, to take the example of Benin, things were deliberately and explicitly stolen. The British went to Benin and they said, this is a punitive expedition. That's the name of it. And they take everything they can find. And when you look at the so-called bronzes now, you can see that they've been ripped off the doors and broken and damaged in various ways. And yet somehow it's still, we need a debate about whether to return them.
We have to establish provenance. We have to make sure that
Indeed.
One of my favorite arguments that I continue to hear from different European institutions is this idea that, the country of origins don't have sufficient institutions, sufficient spaces or whatever to hold these pieces, and they might get destroyed and whatever. And And it's like, and that's such like a white thing to say. And I say that because for
It's the
me,
ultimate white thing to say.
what I think is so unnerving about museums is this idea of like a forced eternality, that it forces things to last forever when things are not supposed to last forever.
Indeed.
Human remains are not supposed to last forever, because people die. People die and they're interred into the earth, and there are funerary practices and whatever practices that assist the transition from this life into the next life, whatever, depending on the group, and then we continue. But all of a sudden, you know, we have to keep these artifacts, these bones, these things, and they're not only are they kept intact, but they are kept in conditions that are like deliberately manipulated in order for them to be able to last forever. So you have to manufacture conditions for the eternality. And I'm writing about this in a chapter, and I'm like, it feels, there's this concept called oh my God, I'm forgetting it. But it's a social psychological concept where there is this anxiety about mortality. And so what emerges out of it are all of these different ways of being in the world, and rituals and symbols that attempt to assuage the anxieties of fears of death. And I almost feel like museums are like these civilizational attempts to assuage Western culture, the United States, Britain, these former empires that have lost their territory but have not lost their pride and their stature. It enables them to think about this idea of foreverness, because we all know that Rome has to fall, but they refuse to believe it. And so in having the conversation about what is the museum, that is all that I think of as the museum. This anxiety around civilizational collapse.
Yes. What a rich set of remarks. Let's just make a couple of straightforward notes. The Parthenon marbles, which the British took in considerable part because they say they're the ones who can take care of them. They scrubbed those things with wire brushes because they thought they didn't look white enough. This is the madness of whiteness, right? These sculptures that were displayed, brightly colored and painted so that you could pick out the detail in the Greek sunshine. When the paint wore off and they're sort of yellowish underneath, they assume they must be white, they scrubbed them. Has this process ended? It has not. In the last couple of days, we've seen that over 70 artworks were attacked with some kind of oil substance in the German museum island, in the Pergamon and elsewhere. And they haven't really released the details of this, but I can imagine, you know, oil goes into stone very easily. It's not going to look great. So even at that pragmatic level, which is not the level either of us really want to talk about this, we don't accept that. No. But let's, you know, your concept that you raised is so insightful to me, and it makes me think so many things. But I just want to say quickly two. One is that I think you're absolutely right to tie this to whiteness, and I think we want to tie this very specifically to racial capitalism. That whiteness within the regime of racial capitalism says we cannot die. We must be eternal. And guess what their symbol of eternal whiteness always is in these racial taxonomies? Guess what? It's a statue. It's a Greek statue, usually one of Apollo. So that there's kind of synergy here between the monument and the museum as preserving this greater than human capacity. And what I think is particularly interesting about the fact that we're having this conversation now, in the context that Dina mentioned at the beginning, is that the paradoxical side effect of the pandemic has been to sort of pause racial capitalism, because we can't do just-in-time manufacturing anymore. That the mask that was sold in the United States for 75 cents because it could be most cheaply manufactured in Wuhan province in China, suddenly that doesn't work so well during a pandemic. And when that has happened, one of the interesting corollaries to that has been people looking around and saying, this is actually, we're perceiving this now, these museums and monuments, as what we began by talking to them about, infrastructures of white supremacy. And they connect. And I think here, finally, if you're reading Cedric Robinson again, as I do often, and in one of his many brilliant footnotes, and there's a whole kind of second book, which is the footnotes in Black Marxism, he refers to John Ruskin's Lectures on Art in 1871. And Ruskin says exactly what you just said, actually, which is, he says, either England, which is his metonym for the United Kingdom, has to continually take over every single piece of what he calls waste ground, terra nullius, land, nothing land, land that's not really land because white people aren't in charge of it, or perish. And that's what, no, I think the whole affect of Brexit, I think the whole affect of Trumpism and of the many of the current far-right movements is this perish anxiety, that the museum stands as the institution to say, no, we will always be here.
Mm-hmm.
We are universal, we are eternal, we are unchanging, we are gods, we are Apollo, you know? And I think, so I think your comment gets right at the heart. And what would it be then to have a museum in which life and death were normal processes, in which statues also die, to use a Chris Marker title from a long time ago, but also, as Felwine Sarr has said, it's absolutely understood in all non-white, non-European cultures, we should say most cultures over most periods of human history, that statues and other artworks and objects die. That's part of the cycle of things. So we're actually talking about an extremely exceptional and rather bizarre period of time over the last 2 centuries in which it was considered vital that nothing ever die.
Except the other that produces the thing that you use to memorialize your own eternal existence.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so I think it's interesting, you know, to your points, when we think about these challenges with like updating the insides of the museum, and, you know, the Africa Hall in the Museum of Natural History, it looked like it was out of a movie from the 1960s. It looked like it has never been changed since it was first installed. I think it was laid out really interestingly, but it's like, it's like this tension where we're in this moment where the British Museum is like, Black Lives Matter, and everyone's like, okay, we'll send our stuff back. And they're like, no. And all of these different institutions are like, Black Lives Matter. And people are like, well, how about you change, or you rehistoricize, you redescribe, you recurate, you whatever. And there's just, you know, there's this big deal about hiring every once in a while, but such tremendous inertia about, you know, if you are going to insist on keeping all of these objects, the very least you could do is to kind of be honest about them.
Right.
One of the most interesting things when I was reading Nicole Fleetwood's newest book, Marking Time, really great book, is at the very beginning where she talks about the parallel evolutions of the museum and the prison, about how they were often relatively close to one another, how, you know, both of them are sites of disciplining. You know, the museum institution is this kind of intellectual, epistemological, ontological, all of the logical disciplinings, where this is how you understand what is normal, what the world is, how the world is structured. And often in the museums, there would be, she writes, like, there would often be objects of like carceral punishment. So there would be like torture objects, and relatively nearby, the prison would be there. So you like leave the museum and you're within a stone's throw of the site of ultimate biopolitical disciplining.
Very good
point. And it's like, after I read that, like, I just, it's like in our politic of abolition, we have to talk about the museum, and we have to talk about, I think, we have to talk about like repatriation as like a decarceration, especially when we're talking about human remains, especially when we're talking about cultural artifacts that belong to indigenous communities that are still here, but in our imaginations are forced to always exist in the far past.
That's such a profound set of remarks that you made there, and it goes very deep. And what it means is we can't, if we are thinking in a frame that's even slightly influenced by abolition, which is to say that Black Lives Matter, then we have to talk about the broadest frames that you've described here. We can't just correct this by 26 objects being sent back by France. They think they've sort of dealt with the whole problem of the hundreds of thousands of objects, but no more than that, the systemic institutionalization of colonial possession that you're describing. To my mind, there's a way in which one can say quite unequivocally that museums are jails, that they contain life forms and life worlds within them, and that those worlds need to be restored and returned. And there are very explicit and obvious examples of this, that the British Museum has Hoa Hakanea, who to Westernize is a Moa from Easter Island, Rapa Nui, as its residents will call it. The people of Rapa Nui see Hoa Hakanea as their ancestor, who is living an other than human life in a different frame and form than us, but is still alive. They brought objects and food to sustain Hoa Hakanea in his current life form. And the British Museum covered that with perspex, that has to be preserved for all time, even though the idea is to, from his own and descendants, to sustain him now in his current condition. And all these objects, if we think that by 2050, a quarter of the world's population will be African, 2050 is not far, that 90% of the museum objects that have their origins in Africa are not in Africa. How then are those young people, and the African populations are now overwhelmingly young people, as are most world populations outside of North America and Western Europe, to form a new living culture if they haven't, the literal contact with their own traditions is not possible? And the excuse that was used in the Universal Museum for a long time was, well, anyone can come and see it, as if it was a simple matter for a 16-year-old from Niger to make their way to Bloomsbury and look at their collections. But in post-pandemic world, we've now got to realize that that excuse is as flimsy as every other, that there is no global public. But there are these immense bodies of work. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, when she talks about abolition, she says, the thing about abolition is it changes everything. You can't just have a little bit of abolition or about abolition over here, but we're going to basically leave things the same. In other words, if we're going to actually take this seriously, then we have to think root and branch about these institutions, understanding that they were made as colonial repositories, places to contain human remains and other than human life and life worlds that are within what we would call objects. That has to change. It simply has to change.
Yeah. I think that we are open to question, comment, suggestion. Cool. Are we, are we just reading from, here's one.
Great. Yeah. Would you like to read it, Zoe, or I can, whatever's easier.
Okay, so the Q&As that are in the thing, should we invite people to share their thoughts out loud?
Yeah, I can. I've asked them over I've written a little comment in the chat box. Basically, if you'd like to be live on audio, please use the raise hand function. And then if not, you can just type in a question in the Q&A box. Okay, I can read that.
Well, Lisa made an important comment about, to the point about Indigenous land stewardship. The surfacing of Native Californians' use of fire to manage land, generate food. The biggest fire, the August complex, has impacted local tribes, and there has been very little acknowledgement of that damage. yeah, I think that it's so interesting, when we're having these conversations about climate change. Well, sorry, that's a little too euphemistic, about ecological crisis, that there's relatively little acknowledgement of the attempts, the historical attempts to kind of prevent these like capitalist incursions on land, that Indigenous communities are currently fighting against, have been fighting against, in terms of, in this country, the ongoing dispossession of land for pipeline use, for fracking. And then around the world, we're seeing like smallholder farmers around the world being pushed off of their land by huge commercial farming. And yeah, yes.
Just a quick supplement to that from the East Coast would be that, in addition to all these issues where Indigenous lands are constantly being encroached upon, the Shinnecock people on the east end of Long Island put up what they described as a monument last year, which has a great seal of the Shinnecock Nation. And underneath it is a billboard where they can display advertising to raise revenue, because the Shinnecock Nation, well, they need money for everything, essentially. And what was very interesting about this was that the Attorney General of the state of New York, Letitia James, who's a very progressive woman in most regards, immediately reached to the 1656 adverse possession of Southampton, which is to say, in legal jargon, the colonization of Southampton, to say that the Shinnecock had no standing to raise this question, to put up a monument on their own land, and got an injunction for this. It's in court, but it's of a piece with the court case that you mentioned, Zoe, which is in appellate court in federal court in New York, and I think has now been rejected. That the legal system continues to enshrine colonization as a fact, as the force that's inherent, the taking away of land, the removal of the traditional stewardship of land. And that's seen as an unalloyed good by white settlement. And yet it has come, what has happened now in California, but it's also happening in Australia with the fires there, of course, the water shortages in places like South Africa, where Indigenous and stewardship has not been respected, is that we're now facing catastrophe, all of us, but especially, of course, Indigenous peoples.
Yeah. There is a comment from P.A. Mullins saying, I think the eternalization drive is tied to Western concepts of truth as needing to be universal, eternal, infinite, to be the only valid truth. So if Western Enlightenment civilization is to be true, which also equals good and moral, it needs to last forever unchanging, which is the direct opposite of most non-Western ideas of truth, that everything is contextual and change is a constant fact of existence. And in fact, what marks existence is change. I mean, absolutely, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, a dear friend of mine who, we're both working a lot on thinking about coloniality, and Sylvia Wynter, we make a lot of jokes about the kind of white Western obsession with linear time. Not only with linear time, but time always only being forward moving. Instead of thinking about time as forward, backwards, it's lateral, it's all of these things that, in any present embodiment, it is also an embodiment of pasthood and of futurity. Yeah, and I think the unchangingness speaks very much to the inertia around museums. They're always talking about, we're going to do a commission, we're going to have a conversation about whether this is something that we can do, we're going to invite the public to have a conversation, we're going to hire a diversity person, who almost always ends up getting fired because they tell the museum that the museum in fact has a diversity problem or a racism problem, however you want to describe it. And there's so much, obviously the entire episteme, it will not change unless a kind of greater force is exerted upon it. But, the museum is just a microcosm of that resistance to change,
on a less elevated note, I can give an example, which is the British Museum has a gallery right inside its front door, which they call the Enlightenment Gallery. And what this is essentially a display of colonial plunder, particularly a shield that's called the Guigal Shield that was taken by Captain Cook when he first landed in what is now called Australia in order to try and colonize it. And some Aora people came towards them, and a British Marine shot and killed one of these people and took the shield. And they displayed this shield on again and again. The descendants of Guigal have identified that they are the descendants and they would like this object back. And the British continue to deny that this entire event happened, even though there's a neat round hole in the middle of the shield, which is very obviously and clearly a bullet hole. They say, no, it must have been caused by something else. And this goes, Charles Sanders Peirce in his theory of the sign defines the index as a bullet hole. That is what indexicality is. So if you're led to deny your own Western philosophical tradition in order to say that a hole is not a hole, it is in fact something else altogether, in order to keep this piece of colonial plunder in a gallery called Enlightenment Gallery, then you might want to look at your Enlightenment and think, what's actually going on here,
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the huge omissions whenever we have conversations about the Enlightenment is that, we talk about this flourishing of visual art and culture and travel and whatever. And it's like, well, the Enlightenment is also when Kant and Hegel were out here just saying the things that they were saying about race. And it is during the Enlightenment that, the transatlantic slave trade is flourishing. Right. And the scientific advancements that are made in the Enlightenment are both like justifying domination and also offering the empirics for why domination happens kind of in this natural way. Like the Enlightenment is what offered us all of these different theories about the number and origins of races, ultimately, angling themselves towards the privileging of whiteness as this kind of emergent civilizational thing. And that's something that I always get very frustrated about when we're like, we need to return to Enlightenment ideals. And it's like, well,
not so much. I mean, even when we have these monuments from the white side of the ledger, as it were, that seem to speak to something else. Turner's Slavers, which is much discussed. Christina Sharp has written beautifully about it recently, way back to Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic. Turner invested in slavery. He bought shares in a company that used enslaved labor in Jamaica. He lost all his money, but it gives a different tang to that poem that he attaches to slavers throwing overboard the dead and dying, where he says, hope, fallacious hope, where is thy market now? Well, maybe it was because he lost money in the slave market that he felt it doesn't diminish the readings of the painting that are possible, because those are always available. I mean, people can do that, but there are no documents of that period that come out without their connection to racial capital and to coloniality. They just aren't. You can't be outside of those things.
Mm-hmm. Ingrid asks, do you think that it is appropriate or that there is a place for memorial museums such as the Red Terror Museum in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to exhibit human remains since the remains are from a genocide in their own country? Yes. I think that when we talk about the museum or the kind of museum structure that we're having a conversation about, I think that there is a difference between one that is kind of internally populated by a plunder and one that kind of exists and functions as like a site of national history. And that is a different set of issues. I think that national history is always contested, especially in places where there are genocides and there is a particular national story. And oftentimes there are people who experienced very differently in their understanding of what the genocide is, or what the phenomenon is, or whatever, is very different. That I don't think that that's necessary. I don't think that that's, I don't know. I think that that's a different set of conversations.
They're difficult ones, aren't they? I mean, I think there was a conversation on Twitter today about photographs coming out from Nigeria of killings that have taken place there, which kind of breached the new protocols that many of us have about not displaying violent imagery. But sometimes if the image, and I think this was true at the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement in this country too, that when Mike Brown was killed, I mean, I remember very vividly sitting, much like I am now, watching my computer, and suddenly these images start to appear.
Mm-hmm.
And it made it, it launched that movement in a way that would not probably have happened otherwise. And I think my friends who are concerned about the very violent effect of war in Armenia at present, which is not really capturing any global attention, again, are saying you need to look, you need to pay attention to this. And if you're not on the dominant side of history, there may be ways in which you do need to use materials that in other circumstances, I think one always want to be checking back with that. And I think that's exactly what happened with Black Lives Matter, right? They got to a point where Black Lives Matter activists and people who were at the center of those campaigns were saying, okay, at this point, if you're not getting this, then you're probably not really ever going to get it, and it's doing us harm. So can you please stop circulating these images? And that was around the time Laquan McDonald, I remember, that seemed to be the breaking point for many people. I mean, particularly terrible. I mean, I can't watch the George Floyd video. I haven't watched it actually. But I understand why it's there. And I understand why it mobilized people in the way that it did. And I understand why activists in Minneapolis broadcast his last words live to encourage people to participate in the resistance to police there. So yeah, I mean, it's important to raise that contradiction, absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm interested in this anonymous question. To what extent, if any, do you find that your own perspectives on museum culture are at root based on Judeo-Christian ethics? That is, thou shalt not steal. If they are, is that worthy of further examination? I also first want to say that Judeo-Christian is not a concept. It is not a theologically correct concept. And it is a kind of epistemologically messy concept. So I don't subscribe to the idea of Judeo-Christian anything. But my perspectives on museum culture come from the fact that my whole family is from Zimbabwe. And, I'm from a country that only gained its independence, in 1980? So 40 years ago. 40 years ago. And kind of looking at the years that have followed formal independence and the neo-colonization and looking at, what's happening across the continent of Africa, my perspectives on museum culture are at root based in the need for reparations for Black people, for African people, and for Indigenous communities around the world. And a part of that reparation, a part of this politic of abolition is repatriation. So it has nothing to do with Christianity, because Christianity was the means by which Zimbabweans and people all around the world were dispossessed of their land. It was the means by which they were colonized and disconnected from their cultures and forcibly assimilated into the kind of Western episteme. So Christianity is of no consequence to me, especially when it comes to theft. Because if people were as dutiful in obeying the 10 Commandments, then none of this probably would have happened.
And I can tell a similar story from the Jewish side. And I think for any person that's Jewish, the idea of Judeo-Christian makes no sense. I mean, Jews have been persecuted by Christians for, 2020 years. So it seems an odd hybrid at best. That said, a lot of my concern as a descendant of migrants and refugees who moved through Palestine and became part of the settlement problem in Palestine is to see the way that Israel has erased and continues to deny the validity of the indigenous Palestinian people and their cultures within the country that's known as Palestine and the occupied territories. And I think for many of us, this is a cause of genuine sadness, actually. I think that the possibilities of Jewish culture, my late friend David Graeber, who made a very beautiful video about this, talking about Emma Goldman, Karl Marx, Baruch Spinoza, all of those thinkers over years, somehow that all seems to have gone. And instead we have the worship of the nation state that's now becoming, in this country, legally mandated. I'm not allowed in my own university to discuss the issue of Palestine because I will then, as a Jew, be called anti-Semitic. So this has become a very contested place and a difficult place. And my own personal sense is that secular Jewish values have been colonized alongside of and secondarily to the colonization of Palestine itself.
I don't know how many more questions. I want to skip to Lee's question. Hello, Lee.
Hello.
And she asks, my question asks, what other forms monuments can take, or should indeed all monuments fall? How might we embrace monuments to impermanence as well as monuments made to be temporary? So maybe this is a question less about monuments than the question or problem of monumentality. I like this question a lot.
I love this question.
And I've been thinking a lot about this question because I've been thinking about the kind of counter monuments that I've seen kind of be erected in order to try to memorialize resistance or memorialize whatever. And one of the best, but also my least favorite example of this is when Kehinde Wiley did his own equestrian monument.
Right.
And so, you know, the question of monumentality has become, okay, so the question is not yes or no, do we tear it down? The question is, what do we erect? Obviously, which is what, you know, Lee is echoing here. And we can't use identical forms to displace and replace the monuments that were created to coloniality. Like, it doesn't make sense to recreate the equestrian monument, which is like the pinnacle of imperial monuments, in order to make some kind of monument or memorial, you know, ode to Blackness. I don't know exactly what I like the idea a lot of things that aren't meant to exist forever. Like I remember the first time I saw like Tibetan monks making a mandala, and it was this beautiful thing that they spent the whole week working on. It was intricate and elaborate, and I went there and then I saw them sweeping it up, and I felt a lot more stressed out than they did, I think. And yeah, I love the idea of like temporariness. I definitely don't like the idea of recreating neoclassical anything. There's a reason that fascists love neoclassicism, but I don't exactly know what the other forms these monuments can take, because I don't think that there is a kind of preset, prefabricated idea of the forms that they should take. Like what's happening with Lava Thomas in San Francisco. And the board decided, you know, initially that was not the kind of monument that needed to be erected because it wasn't as recognizable as some of the other classical forms of monument making and statue making. I feel very comfortable not having an answer, because I think that we should be open to the potential of multiple forms. I know that's kind of a cop-out, but that's all I have, I think.
No, I don't think anybody's going to be thinking that as a cop-out. Lee, thank you for this question. This is a very rich question. If you don't mind me answering it somewhat egocentrically in terms of some of my own thinking around this. For a long time, when I wrote this book called A Counterhistory of Visuality, and that's 10 years ago now. And at that time, it was really hard to see past the monumentality of colonialism and its dominance. And what one wanted to do was create a counter to that. And the anti-monument or the counter-monument that Zoe's talked about was, I think, as close as we got. What I think is really interesting about the current moment since the George Floyd uprising and since Rhodes Must Fall, which is itself the culmination of a long history, of course, is that we're beginning to think about something else. And I think there are going to need to be a number of things that will need to happen here. I think we do need a kind of ephemeral monument that goes back to Zoe's opening reading, where white people are made to think, and I speak as somebody who is identified as white, are made to think deeply about how whiteness constructed itself. But we don't want those monuments to be permanent, because that would be awful, right? They're a kind of learning process. And how can that be done without it being sledgehammer didactic? How can it be participatory? How can it be liberatory? How can people who are identified as white come to see the setting aside of being identified as a liberatory moment? And then I think what the group that I'm involved in right now, just to speak purely personally, we have this phrase living monuments. And I think the idea here would be that exactly as Zoe has just said, the monument would have a lifetime. It might be a minute, it might be a week, it might be whatever the life cycle is appropriate for it, but that it wouldn't claim to be there, for eternity. That's the imperial mindset, the 1,000-year Reich, the monument that lives longer than bronze, all of those kinds of things. We're wanting to think then about what is at the heart of Black Lives Matter. What is a life? What does it mean for life to matter? Whose life matters? In what way does life itself matter? And in the midst of this pandemic, all of us, I assume, are addressing that question in new and different ways. And I hope that what comes out of this is a proliferation of forms. That one of the ways that colonialism holds power is it says, this is the only way things can be. Mrs. Thatcher used to say this all the time. There is no alternative. Mm-hmm. And neoliberalism has said that to us for this past 40 odd years. And it's our job, I think, those of us who work in this particular niche of the world, to say, oh yeah, there is. And we're going to imagine it. And we're going to do work collaboratively, collectively, in lots of dialogue to think about what that future might look like, because they took the future away from us, along with many other things. There was supposed to be this great thing called the future when I was a kid, and now it's this. That's not good enough, right? And so we really need to reclaim that.
I want to combine two questions because they're both about contemporary art museums, fine art museums. Oh, cool. So Isa asks, is there any type of acquisition that isn't violent? Is there any ethical way to understand the so-called protection of art objects when that protection has always been exactly what puts them in danger or as a result of violence? If no, what brings about the abolition of museums as a set of relationships that aims to kill community connection to arts? And then the kind of twin question by Alex, could we speak on how contemporary art museums also perpetuate coloniality, and are there examples of art museums / curation that break away from Western modes of exhibition? Is there any type of acquisition that isn't violent? My cop-out answer would be there is no ethical consumption, ethical transaction under capitalism, so no. But I'm thinking about contemporary art as perpetuating coloniality. It's the canon itself is a colonial production. And, this idea that Black art is having a moment is a perpetuation of coloniality when, you know, Black art has been a thing for however many centuries Black people have, you know, thousands of years that Black people have existed, you know, more honestly would be, you know, not that Black art is having a renaissance, but that, you know, institutions, it is no longer socially, politically advantageous to pretend that Black art does not exist, or that other art that is not the canon does not exist. The abolition of museums, you know, I don't really know about that, but one thing that I am really passionate about is kind of an accessibility question. You know, it's Berger's whole idea of art being, I mean, I will just constantly quote John Berger because he's one of my favorite people on the planet, but you know, the whole reason that he did the series Ways of Seeing was to impress upon publics that art is for everyone. And I am a huge, like, I could not be more opposed to this idea of having to pay to visit a museum, because you cannot convince me that a museum is an educational institution that is for the public. I technically have $15 to go to the Met. Do I want to spend $15 to go to the Met? No. And I think that for a lot of people, that question is not even so much a question of desire and more so a question of like just fiscal ability. I think that museums should be free. And I think that I think that that would be, or that is an important like single step in really trying to foster a relationship between communities and art. I'm trying to think of museum curations that break away from Western modes of exhibition, but in terms of spaces, like I really appreciate, for example, the lab, and the time that I have worked with the lab. You know, we had so much agency and ability to do what we wanted to do in the space, and you know, we're given money, and as we saw with, you know, with the Whitney recently that acquired pieces through fundraisers, that is not a thing that every institution does, that a lot of institutions do, which is to pay people fairly. We know that that's not how the art market works. We know that the art market is a place for rich people to launder their money. Let me not go on that tangent, but
I do.
I don't know. Do you know of kind of, I know curators whose work I like, but I can't think of anything that is expressly kind of counter structural in the way that it does exhibition.
I mean, I think of probably things that, I don't know whether you'll call them museums or not, but I think of Mozirine showing experimental cinema in Tahrir Square during the Arab Spring, or the Cine Pops movement during the Algerian Revolution, where Maoist and other radical third cinema was being projected in the streets, sometimes to women-only audiences, so the women were allowed to come. So it's about, I think it goes to your point, Zoe, about capitalism, frankly. I mean, I do think this, but within the frame of coloniality. So it's, you know, Fanon is right in that decolonizing will be perceived by the colonizer as violent because it breaks the frames. It'll break the frames under which value has been considered appropriate to share, display, conserve, and so on. One of the things that art is an extraordinary kind of example of the whole commodity process, right? Where something gets turned into spectacular form of value because of labor. And a statue is a really good example of that, and so are many other objects. If we are to think about abolition in the broad frame, then that modality will want to change, so that, yeah, museums are free, but so is healthcare, so is education, so is there a universal basic income. So there are other forms of, that's the kind of future then that we need to start to imagine. A few years ago, about when they did an opinion poll in Germany, 25% of young people said they wanted to be artists. And I think what they meant by that was not only that, they wanted to go and paint or sculpt or make video, whatever it was, but the art was one of the few modalities of human existence they could understand that was free, that wasn't alienated, that wasn't entirely conscripted into the bullshit job routine, where you do a job that you know is basically pointless. Or even if you do a job that you like, there's this enormous chunk of it that you hate because you have to do it because of the way that the bureaucracy entails. So museums, you know, the museum visit is often perceived by people that are made to go as a punishment rather than as a pleasure. And so if we can create spaces in which people actively want to be there more than anywhere else, because it enhances their sense of their freedom, as happened in Tahrir Square, or as happened when some of the objects from Benin were returned. Felwine Sarr talks about this, and there was a queue he shows in the report, this long queue of very young people down the street wanting to see these things they'd heard about their whole lives, but never had the opportunity to see before. And then when people were kind of crushed when they realized it was a temporary loan exhibition and it went back, all the stuff went back. So these questions go very deep.
I think that we've got time to take a couple more questions. Miriam's question is really interesting. I wonder if you could comment on the French government repatriating the remains of Algerian fighters and the ways that the preservation of human remains as trophies, not unlike the phenomenon of big game hunting, parallels the evolution of the museums of natural history. I actually remember seeing a video of that on I think it was on Algerian Independence Day this year that they actually sent them back. And it was just like these two huge cargo planes. And yeah, I think that this is a really interestingly phrased question because it speaks to the beginning of our conversation when we were like, why are there people in the Natural History Museum? Unless you are doing, the thing that Australia did for a very, very long time, which was to classify Indigenous people as literally being part of nature. As, obviously Australia is not unique in this. But I think that is what it is. If you consider Indigenous people to be animals, if the land is populated, if the land is functionally terra nullius, you arrive, there are Indigenous people, whatever, you can still take it. It's you have already kind of rendered these Indigenous people to animal life, or at least to some kind of non-human life. And so they can be trophies. They can be akin to, going to Africa, killing an elephant and hanging it on your wall. I'm going to think a lot more about and go and read a lot more about when people began to appear in natural history museums, or if indigeneity as a part of nature has always been a part of the matrix of the Natural History Museum, because I'm not quite sure of that history.
Yeah, my sense is that there's a very strong intersection here. I mean, people like Madison Grant, who was one of the most appalling white supremacists, wrote this book called The Passing of the Great Race, but was also instrumental in the conservation of the bison. It wouldn't have happened without him, and the institution of national parks. And the notion of conservation is actually integral with the notion of racial hierarchy and white supremacy. And great big game hunting is the metonym for that. And so the statue of the Roosevelt outside the American Museum of Natural History is him on a big game hunt. So the two figures either side of him, the Indian and the African supposedly, are carrying his guns. And you can see inside, you can see a video of Roosevelt doing exactly this, being carried through the African landscape with African porters behind him carrying his weapons. And he'll only pick up his weapon at the precise moment where it's carefully arranged for him that an animal is essentially standing in front of him and he gets to shoot it. Yeah. The animals that are on display in the dioramas within the American Museum of Natural History were mostly shot by Roosevelt and by other American Museum of Natural History curators. So the overlap is direct. I mean, the dramatic display of elephants that's right inside the front door, and not coincidentally, you go past the Roosevelt Monument, past those appalling murals that Zoe mentioned earlier on, and then you're in the Hall of African Mammals, and there's this kind of array of stuffed elephants. They were shot by the Roosevelt family and by the curator who later ended up stuffing them. who went specifically to Africa for that purpose. And you can go around each display case, if you have the moral stamina, in that museum and discover similar kinds of histories. So I deeply appreciate this question, because I think there's an intersection that's profound and important between the Natural History Museum, conservation, and the national park, another name for which is monument. They're often, you know, the Grand Canyon, for example, is a monument. And is referred to as such by the Park Service, who are incidentally good people, and I have nothing against the Park Service people; they're great. But this is another way to tell the story that brings in these elements that we should see as mutually constitutive and part of the same set of practices and discourses.
Okay.
How long have we got?
We've got a whole bunch more, but
I mean, I've got nowhere to go. I'm just sat at my kitchen table.
all right, let's take one more.
Okay.
I think that we've already gotten into this a little bit, but I think that Panache's question, can we consider this issue of the visibility of dead Black bodies and its presumed utility in awareness raising across time and space? Reinscribes the fungibility of Black life globally. As a Black South African, I've only ever seen a dead white body in the televised broadcast of the Oscar Pistorius Riva Steenkamp case, which was heavily debated by the very same white South African media that does not flinch in broadcasting Black death and trauma. I mean, I think that the whole purpose of putting human people in a natural history museum is also reinscribing the fungibility of not only kind of Black life, but all of these various indigeneities. You know, what does it say about kind of modernity, about Western thought, about Western education, whatever, that the way that we learn about a people is to look at a kind of, you know, in South Africa, there was I forget which museum in Cape Town, but they had Bushman life casts, which were literally like molds made of different San people and put into the museums. And they were later taken down in part because they were reclassified actually as as illegally acquired human remains based on the argument that there was like hair and other DNA matter inside of the casts. And so they were removed from sight. But I think this question of this kind of like hypervisibility of Black death and fungibility and the presence of a very particular kind of African in natural history museums are all a part of the same system that demands consumption, or that consumes as its way of learning about, as its way of educating itself. Because it's like you don't see like white people in natural history museums, even though, you know, in 1865, when this particular Indigenous person was doing XYZ, white people were also doing things. Right. There is no like separate universe, like, you know, and so then I guess like, yeah, the opposite question is like, why is it not why is it not inappropriate, or why is it not appropriate, but why is there no, why is there no impulse to go and dig up white people? Because we know that it's inappropriate, because we know that humans deserve a certain amount of dignity after death. And I won't go on a rant about that, but yeah, I think that those things are all connected and kind of are materialized in really interesting ways in the museum.
I'm struck by your evocation here of Mamie Till, and this resonates in so many ways throughout the whole of the Black Lives Matter movement recently, and the endless replay of the George Floyd murder video, which, as you say, is entirely inconceivable in the case of any form of white death, which has been by and large erased. But interestingly, one counter to that has been in the African American Museum in DC. There's one space which is particularly different than every other space in the museum, which is the space where they display Emmett Till's casket. And this is the only space in the museum where you are not permitted to take a photograph. And I think you don't want to see selfies of people with Emmett Till's casket and so on. But it does also, I think, indicate something of the reverse of what you're describing here. Mamie Till said famously, "I want everyone to see what happened to my son, for all the world to see," which is the title of Louise Burge's book. Right? And the curators obviously thought at great length about what they wanted to do with this sacred object. And they decided that they could only do it by banning. And there are people there who are very careful to remind you you're not allowed, and they're watching, and they do not want to see the Instagram with Emmett Till's casket. And I totally understand that, and I support that. But I think it does also tell us something about the limits of the effect of the image of violence. And I think we're wanted to believe that, and this was a central part to the civil rights movement, that you could show people the extent to which the colonial and segregating state was prepared to use violence, and that would then have a set of consequences, that empathy and outrage and cries for justice would result from that spectatorship. And you could say that the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were in some sense indicative of that. But if you look at how the civil rights activists felt in the mid-60s, they didn't feel they had won at all. They felt actually that their whole movement had somehow been co-opted and that they had lost its way. And King's final book, Where Do We Go From Here?, takes a very different set of directions towards ending militarization, towards ending poverty, as well as the necessary structure contest against racism and racialization. So these histories, I think, are extremely important to think about. And one wants to constantly, I think, check back in with social movements and with communities. What is the response here? My very first action on this was years ago, having been to Australia in the late 1990s and realizing that the Aboriginal prohibition on the display of deceased people, and then wanting to show in one of my classes T.H. Huxley's anthropometry device, which has an Aboriginal person being measured. And I thought, well, how would it affect this if I simply removed, I had to use silver tape, it was that long ago, the image of the Aboriginal person? And we had the whole workshop we spent discussing that. But doing that act of redaction became the subject around which we wanted to discuss. And I think Christina Sharp and others have raised this issue of redaction as a really important way to think this actively.
Absolutely. I want to thank everyone so much for coming. I'm so sorry that we weren't able to answer all of the questions. There were a couple of questions about sources. I think a couple questions about sources, kind of citations about the relationship between the prison and the museum, as well as some about the history, the very, very racist history of the conservation movement in the United States. And we, wherever this ends up living, I will be sure to put some great things to read. There are some really, really interesting things, especially about the conservation movement. Thank you, Nick, so much for joining me this evening. Thank you, Dina, so much for having us. This has been a really, really great conversation.
Well, my thanks to both of you. Thank you.
Absolutely incredible. I appreciate your time so much, and I can't wait to watch this like 3 more times. So appreciate it. All right, everyone, have a great night. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.